For years, fans of classic Hollywood action and Western films have speculated on the dynamic between two of the most rugged and respected stars of their time, James Garner and Charles Bronson. Both carved their legacies in stone with very different approaches to stardom, yet their names are forever linked in the annals of movie history. Now, after decades of silence, the late James Garner's long unreleased statements about Charles Bronson have surfaced, and they are as revealing as they are shocking. These words, unearthed from a rare unpublished interview and corroborated by those close to Garner in his later years, finally peel back the curtain on what he really thought of Bronson, their off-screen tensions, and the gritty, testosterone-charged world of old Hollywood. This revelation changes how we understand two of the industry's most iconic tough guys, and it hits harder than a slug from a 44 James Garner, the charming, easygoing actor known best for Maverick, and The Rockford. Files was beloved for his wit, affability, and anti-authoritarian streak. He brought a sense of humanity to the stoic American hero archetype, and in real life, he was just as fiercely independent. But behind his calm, polished exterior was a man who had fought tooth and nail to protect his reputation, his co-stars, and his craft. Charles Bronson, on the other hand, was the quiet enigma, an actor with a steely gaze and a deep-seated intensity that made him the quintessential silent killer on screen. Bronson rarely gave interviews and was infamously private, a man whose past was filled with hardship and whose eyes told stories his lips never would. Hollywood labeled them both tough, but their definitions of toughness couldn't have been more different. And that difference, Garner finally revealed, created an unspoken wall between them for decades. Garner begins by recalling their first real interaction in the early 1960s, on a set where their names shared the same call sheet but not the same approach to performance. According to Garner, Bronson's behavior wasn't overtly hostile. It was guarded, closed off, and cold. Charlie never said much, Garner admitted. You could walk into a room, and it was like he wasn't even there. He had this way of shrinking into the shadows until the cameras rolled, and then, boom, he was electric. But off-screen, you got nothing. No camaraderie, no small talk, just walls. Garner, who valued teamwork and a family-like atmosphere on set, found Bronson's aloofness jarring. I don't need a guy to be my best friend, Garner clarified. But when you're sharing scenes every day, it helps if there's a little humanity between takes. But things didn't end there. Garner went further, revealing what many have only whispered in Hollywood circles. Bronson's toughness wasn't just a persona, it bled into everything he did. Charlie carried the weight of his upbringing like a badge of honor, Garner said. He grew up dirt poor, one of 15 kids, worked in coal mines. That does something to a man. But where I tried to leave that pain behind, Charlie wore it like armor. He didn't trust people, and that made him difficult. Not mean, not unprofessional, but difficult. Garner, whose own childhood was marred by abuse and instability, felt a strange mirror when he looked at Bronson. But instead of connection, it bred quiet resentment. He had this chip on his shoulder like the world owed him something, Garner added. And when you think like that, it's hard to let anyone in. I've worked with a lot of hard men in this business. Steve McQueen, Clint Eastwood, guys who didn't have to say much to own a room. But Bronson, he had this edge like he was always waiting for someone to cross him. The silence between them on set wasn't just awkward. It was sometimes palpable. Garner described one tense moment during a joint promotional shoot when Bronson, irritated by a change in call time, nearly walked off set. Garner, the consummate professional, tried to de-escalate. I said something like, "Hey Charlie, it's just 10 minutes. He looked at me like I'd insulted his entire bloodline. Didn't say a word. Just stared. You don't forget a stare like that. Yet for all the personal distance, Garner never doubted Bronson's talent. He was good. Damn good, Garner said without hesitation. He didn't need dialogue. He had that rare ability to say everything with his face. You believed he could kill you with a glance, and that's not something you can teach. Still, Garner felt that Bronson's intense screen persona often limited him, boxing him into roles that failed to show the man's potential range. There was a sadness to Charlie that I think no one ever tapped into. He could have done more, shown more sides of himself, but he chose to be the lone wolf. That was his call. The emotional distance wasn't just felt by Garner, it was echoed by others. Garner shared conversations with directors, crew members, and even co-stars who all recounted similar experiences. "No one really knew Charlie," he said. "You could work with him for months and come away knowing nothing about his life. He didn't go to the parties, didn't do the press junkets unless he had to. In a way, he was a ghost." But Garner emphasized that his reflections weren't meant to disparage Bronson. "It's not about blaming him, I get it. This business chews you up, but he didn't make it easy for people to care about him." What struck Garner most, he confessed, was how Bronson's life was defined by survival. From coal mines to the battlefield to the ruthless world of Hollywood, Bronson never had the luxury of letting his guard down. "He was always in fight mode," Garner said. "And when you're always fighting, even when the battle's over, you forget how to stop." Garner admitted that this made him feel sorry for Bronson, not in a condescending way, but in the way one damaged soul recognizes another. "I think we could have been friends in another life," he mused. "But in this one, there was too much pain, too much armor between us." Garner also reflected on the irony that while Bronson became the embodiment of masculinity in cinema, he was also one of its loneliest figures. He never seemed happy even when he was the biggest star in the world. "I remember seeing him at an event years later. Everyone was laughing, mingling. Charlie was sitting alone with a drink, just watching. Not sad, not angry, just alone. Like he was always observing, never participating." In a poignant moment, Garner admitted that age and perspective softened his view. "You get older, and the grudges start to fade," he said. "I realized Charlie wasn't being rude. He was surviving. We all survive in different ways." Garner said he regretted not trying harder to break through Bronson's walls. "Maybe I should have tried again, asked him about his family, his past, anything. But back then, egos get in the way. You think, if he doesn't want to talk, fine, his loss. But now, I see it differently. Sometimes the people who push you away the hardest are the ones who need connection the most." One story in particular stayed with Garner, the only time Bronson ever opened up to him. It was late on location, and they were the last two in the trailer after a long day of filming. "We were just sitting there sipping coffee," Garner said. Out of nowhere, Charlie says, "You ever dream of getting out of this town?" I didn't know what to say. It was the most human thing I'd ever heard from him. I said, "All the time." He nodded, then went quiet. That was it. But in that moment, I saw the man behind the myth. That sliver of connection stayed with Garner for years. It made him reflect not just on Bronson, but on the entire Hollywood system that pitted strong men against one another, rewarded stoicism, and punished vulnerability. We were all playing roles, even off camera. Tough guy, rebel, loner. But what we really needed was someone to ask, "How are you doing? Really?" In the end, James Garner's long-withheld thoughts on Charles Bronson are not the scathing tell-all many might expect. They're complicated, layered, and deeply human. Garner didn't hate Bronson. He didn't admire him blindly either. What he saw was a fellow warrior in the trenches, one who bore his scars on the inside. Charlie didn't need the world's approval, Garner concluded. He needed peace. I hope he found it. And with those words, a silence of decades is broken. What remains is a portrait of two men, shaped by hardship, fame, and a world that never allowed them to let their guards down. In Garner's final reflections, we find not only his truth about Bronson, but a haunting echo of an era, long gone, an era where strength meant silence, and the greatest battles were the ones never spoken about. Garner's words don't just illuminate the man Charles Bronson was. They also hold a mirror to himself and the Hollywood culture both men navigated with their own brand of survival. It's telling that Garner chose to finally speak out about Bronson after so many years had passed, and after both men had reached the twilight of their careers. There's something powerful about the passage of time. It softens grudges, reframes rivalries, and brings clarity to moments that once seemed insignificant. In Bronson's silence, Garner eventually found a kind of wisdom. In his own silence, he now offers a deeper truth. Hollywood in the mid-20th century was a place of myth-making. Studios didn't just build stars, they built legends, often at the expense of human connection. Men like Garner and Bronson were turned into symbols of masculinity, whether they wanted to be or not. But masculinity, as it was defined back then, left little room for vulnerability. Garner, despite his charm and affable exterior, carried his own pain quietly. He had endured abuse from a stepmother, lost his father for stretches of his youth, and carried physical injuries from both war and stunt work. Bronson, by contrast, grew up in extreme poverty, rarely spoke about his feelings, and was hardened by a childhood in the Pennsylvania coal mines. These men weren't just tough on screen, they were forged by adversity long before the cameras started rolling. And yet, while Garner wore his pain lightly and used humor as a shield, Bronson wore his like an iron mask. It was impenetrable, stoic, and often misread as arrogance. But Garner, in his older years, could finally see that it wasn't ego that kept Bronson quiet. It was protection. In a business that exposed every flaw, Bronson simply refused to give anyone access to his. There's something almost noble about that kind of self-preservation, even if it meant sacrificing friendship and approachability. Garner acknowledged that both of them were playing roles, not just in films, but in life. They had to be. In the golden age of the studio system, image was everything. If you cried, you were weak. If you questioned the system, you were labeled difficult. So you showed up, hit your marks, and kept your personal demons buried beneath layers of sarcasm or silence. Garner had his ways of coping. His notorious clashes with studio executives showed he wasn't afraid to speak up for himself or others. But he also knew how to navigate relationships, how to offer warmth in a cold industry. Bronson, on the other hand, seemed to have locked his true self behind the steel curtain of minimalism, keeping people at bay with grunts and glares. But Garner's reflections make it clear he didn't see Bronson as a villain or a rival. He saw him as a product of pain, just like so many others in that era. In fact, his later empathy for Bronson suggests that he wished things had gone differently. Maybe if they'd met outside of the studio walls, far from the spotlight, there could have been a connection. Maybe if they'd both had a little less to prove and a little more time to listen, two of Hollywood's hardest men might have shared more than just screen time. They might have shared understanding. The moment Garner described, where Bronson, unexpectedly and briefly, asked if he ever dreamed of getting out of the industry, was the crack in the armor. A tiny, fleeting window into the soul of a man who had spent decades guarding it. That moment, almost missed, speaks volumes. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't even emotional on the surface. But for Bronson, it was everything. And Garner, to his credit, never forgot it. It lingered with him. Because in that quiet question, there was yearning. A longing to be seen not as the action hero or the stone-faced killer, but as a man who sometimes wondered what life might be like beyond the lights, the scripts, the obligations of stardom. When Garner speaks of that one exchange, it feels like a confession, not just about Bronson, but about himself. It was a recognition that maybe neither of them had found what they were truly looking for in Hollywood. The fame, the money, the accolades, they didn't erase the scars they both carried from childhood or from the grind of keeping up an image that was, at times, suffocating. As audiences, we often forget that behind every iconic close-up, every perfectly delivered line, is a human being who has lived through unimaginable things. Garner's decision to finally speak about Bronson reminds us that even legends carry burdens. Even the toughest men have moments of doubt, regret, and sadness. And sometimes, those moments go unspoken for years, waiting for the right time or the right person to finally give them voice. What emerges from Garner's reflections is not a story of rivalry, but of missed opportunities. It's a story of two men who, shaped by hardship, became symbols of strength, yet found little solace in that identity. Their silence wasn't cowardice. It was survival. Their distance wasn't disdain. It was self-preservation. And in that, there is something deeply human, deeply tragic. In telling this story now, Garner isn't just remembering Bronson, he's honoring him. Not with fake praise or exaggerated anecdotes, but with honesty. He paints a picture of a man who was never truly understood and perhaps never allowed himself to be. He doesn't rewrite history to make himself look better. Instead, he lays it bare. The tension, the quiet moments, the regrets, and the truths that time finally allowed him to see. And so, with this final revelation, we are left with a haunting, yet beautiful portrait, not of enemies, not even of friends, but of two men forever etched into cinematic history, bonded by the loneliness of their craft and the unspoken language of pain. Garner's words are not just about Bronson. They are a farewell to an era of acting where silence was both a shield and a prison, and where the real stories, the rawest truths, often lived off camera in the spaces between the lines. It's in those spaces that we now find them, James Garner and Charles Bronson, two icons shaped by fire, remembered not only for their legendary roles, but for the complex, conflicted, and ultimately human men they were beneath the surface.